A home once lost, a love that remains. The Alabama sky bold into hues of gold and crimson as the sun dipped below the horizon, its fading light casting long shadows through the lace curtains of Pastor Samuel Hayes' modest home. The quiet hum of cicadas filled the evening air, a familiar symphony that had been the backdrop of his life for more years than he cared to count. Seated in his worn leather armchair, Samuel exhaled deeply, his weathered hands resting on the pages of his open Bible. He wasn't really reading, hadn't been for the past half hour. His mind had drifted, wandering back to the voices that once filled this house, voices now reduced to memories that echoed off the empty walls. The house felt too big these days, too quiet. A framed photograph sat on the coffee table before him, the glass reflecting the dim glow of the table lamp. 5 boys, his boys, each with a story of their own, scars from the world they had survived before they ever walked through his door. Marcus, the eldest, steady and responsible, carrying burdens long before his time. Devon, fierce and passionate, always ready to fight for what was right, even when it got him into trouble. Jamal, the thinker, the strategist, his sharp mind always analyzing, always searching for solutions. Eric, quiet, reserved, the one who spoke only when necessary, but never without meaning. Andrew, the youngest, full of life, full of dreams, full of hope even when the world had given him every reason to give up. His sons, his chest ached at the thought of them, scattered across the country now, their lives carrying them far from the home he had built for them. It had been 4 years since they had all been together in the same place. Phone calls and letters filled some of the void, but nothing replaced the feeling of having them near. Nothing replaced family. As if on cue, the sharp ring of the telephone shattered the silence. Samuel jolted slightly before glancing at the old landline mounted on the wall. Few people called this late. A strange flutter of anticipation stirred in his chest as he reached for the receiver. "Hello." His voice was steady, warm, but cautious. There was a pause on the other end, a deep breath. Then, "Dad." Samuel recognized the voice instantly. Marcus, the steady one, his eldest. His grip tightened around the phone. An old habit from the days when phone calls meant bad news. "Marcus, son, how are you?" There was another pause, a hesitation. "I'm doing good, Dad. Real good. But listen, we all are coming home." Samuel's breath hitched. His heart began to race. "All of you?" he asked, barely trusting his own voice. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, his voice steady but carrying an edge of something unspoken. "All 5 of us. For your retirement celebration." Samuel sank deeper into his chair, the weight of those words pressing against his chest. For years, his congregation had been urging him to slow down, to retire. He had served at Grace Baptist Church for over 3 decades, watched generations grow up under his sermons, baptized newborns who later stood at the altar to be married. He had given his life to this calling, to service. And now it was coming to an end. "I'm honored, son," he said, keeping his voice steady despite the emotions surging within him. "I'd love to have you all here." Marcus hesitated again. "There's more," he admitted, his voice lower now. "We've been planning something, Dad. For years." Samuel frowned slightly. "Something?" "You'll see," Marcus said, and for the first time since the call started, Samuel could hear a hint of excitement in his son's voice. We need you to trust us." Samuel chuckled softly, though unease curled in his stomach. "Son, I've trusted you since the day you walked into my home." "That's never changed." The two exchanged a few more words, confirming travel details before Marcus finally said his goodbyes. Samuel remained seated long after hanging up the phone. His heart felt full, yet a strange weight pressed against him, a feeling he couldn't quite name. Something about Marcus' voice, something about the way he had said, "We need you to trust us." That night, Samuel dreamt of his father. The memory came like a ghost from the past, his childhood home standing proud on a stretch of green Alabama land. He saw himself as a boy, 10 years old, sitting on the front porch, his bare feet swinging against the wooden steps. His father, James Hayes, sat beside him, his large hands whittling a piece of wood. "You see, boy," his father said, his voice rich with wisdom, "a home ain't just walls and a roof. It's where a man lays his burdens down, where he finds peace, where he belongs." Samuel watched the knife glide over the wood, shaping it with each deliberate stroke. "But it's gotta be earned," his father added, voice thick with something Samuel didn't understand back then. "A man's home is a reflection of what he's worked for. It ain't something that's just given." Samuel had never forgotten those words. He remembered the day they lost that house. He remembered his father standing in the doorway, a letter from the bank clutched in his trembling hands. He remembered the way his father's shoulders slumped, the look of a man who had given everything and still lost. Even as a child, Samuel had known something in his father broke that day. And now, decades later, as he awoke in the quiet of his own home, that old pain stirred within him again. He reached for the photograph on the table, his fingers tracing the faces of his sons. A feeling settled deep in his bones. They were coming home, but something told him they weren't just coming for his retirement. They were bringing something else, something big. And for the first time in a long time, Pastor Samuel Hayes felt something he hadn't felt in years, a fear that he wasn't quite ready for whatever it was his sons were planning. The return of the five. The Alabama morning carried the scent of fresh dew and turned soil, the air thick with the promise of summer. Pastor Samuel Hayes stood at his front window, hands clasped behind his back, watching the road. The long dirt driveway stretched out in front of his house like a path leading to both the past and the future. His sons were coming home. His fingers twitched with nervous energy. For 30 years, he'd given everything to his church, to his congregation, and most of all, to them. He had taken in 5 scared, abandoned boys the world had given up on. He had fought for them, prayed over them, sacrificed for them. And now, after years of distance, they were all coming back. But the excitement in his chest was tainted by something else. Apprehension. There was something in Marcus's voice on the phone last night, something carefully controlled, something unspoken. Samuel had spent his entire life reading people, knowing their worries before they even voiced them. And last night, he'd heard it. Something was coming. The first car arrives. A deep rumbling engine broke the morning stillness. Samuel's heart skipped a beat. Through the window, he saw a black SUV turn onto his property, kicking up dust as it approached. It stopped just before the porch, and the door opened. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out. Marcus, his eldest. Samuel's chest tightened at the sight of him. Still strong, still steady, but something about his face, the lines of worry creasing his forehead, made Samuel's stomach twist. Marcus had grown into a leader, not just for his brothers, but in the world beyond. A businessman, a man who carried responsibility the way others carried weight on their backs. Samuel stepped onto the porch, his shoes creaking on the old wooden planks. Marcus looked up and met his gaze. For a moment, they just stood there. Then Marcus took 2 long strides forward and pulled his father into a hug. Samuel hesitated, only for a second, before wrapping his arms around his son. "I missed you, Dad," Marcus said quietly, his voice lower than Samuel remembered. Samuel's throat tightened. "I missed you too, son." The others arrived. The next car wasn't far behind. Samuel turned as another vehicle pulled into the driveway, this one a deep blue sedan. 2 doors swung open at once. Devin and Jamal. Samuel barely had time to react before Devin stormed up the steps, his familiar grin splitting his face. Pop. Samuel was nearly knocked back as Devin wrapped his strong arms around him. "You still smell like church, Devin teased, stepping back and wrinkling his nose. Samuel chuckled, shaking his head. "Boy, you still don't know how to behave, do you?" Jamal followed behind, quieter, more composed. His eyes held questions Samuel wasn't ready to answer yet. "Dad," Jamal said, voice warm but careful. He reached out, and Samuel gripped his hand firmly before pulling him in for a hug. Jamal had always been the deep thinker, always watching, analyzing. And Samuel knew, even now, that he was assessing him. Before he could say anything, the third car pulled up. Eric and Ander, the last of his boys. The youngest, Ander, was out first, his boyish excitement unchanged despite being a grown man. His curly hair bounced as he jogged up the steps. Eyes bright. "Dad," he practically shouted before throwing himself into Samuel's arms. Samuel chuckled but held him tight. "Still causing trouble?" Ander grinned. "Always." Eric followed behind, slower, quieter, the last one to approach. Samuel had always understood Eric's silence. Some people spoke with words. Eric spoke with presence. Samuel met his son's deep gaze and nodded once. Eric nodded back. That was enough. Back in the house came alive again. Laughter bounced off the walls. Ander ran through the halls, reclaiming his childhood room like a kid on Christmas. Devin had already claimed his spot in the kitchen, demanding to know if Samuel still made cornbread the right way. Jamal leaned against the counter, his dark eyes scanning everything, like he was measuring how much had changed. Eric moved with quiet purpose, setting his bags down without a word. And Marcus was watching everything, waiting. Samuel caught it. Something was still unsaid. Finally, when everyone had settled in, Marcus spoke. "Dad, let's talk." Samuel's heart skipped a beat. The room went quiet. The other four brothers suddenly looked at Marcus. They knew what was coming. Samuel didn't. He cleared his throat, motioning for Marcus to follow him to the porch. They stepped outside, the screen door creaking closed behind them. For a moment, the only sound was the distant song of cicadas. Then Marcus turned to face him. "Dad, we didn't just come for your retirement." Samuel's grip tightened on the porch railing. He had known, had felt it, but nothing could prepare him for what Marcus said next. "We built you a house." Samuel felt his knees go weak. He turned too sharply toward his son. "What?" Marcus held steady. "We've been planning this for years, all five of us. We built you a house, Dad." Samuel's breath shook. "Why?" Devin's voice suddenly came from behind them. "Because you gave us a home. It's time we gave you one." Samuel's chest ached. He knew this moment should feel like joy, gratitude, happiness. But instead, fear gripped his soul. Not because of the gift, because of what it meant. Because there was another house, a house his father had lost. A house that had ruined a man who had spent his life trying to keep it. A house that had destroyed Samuel's childhood. His father had died never getting that house back. And now, his sons had built him one. Samuel swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. I don't know if I can accept this." The porch fell into silence. The air shifted. Marcus's face didn't change, but his shoulders tensed. Samuel had just said the wrong thing. The silence between them stretched, heavy with words left unsaid. And Samuel knew. This conversation was just beginning. A gift too heavy to carry. The air on the porch had thickened, heavy with the weight of unspoken words between Samuel and his sons. Samuel felt his pulse in his throat, his breath coming slower than usual, like his own body was trying to stall time. Across from him, Marcus stood firm, his broad frame motionless except for the tightening of his jaw. The other brothers, who had joined them outside, watched carefully, waiting for Samuel's reaction to change, waiting for the joy they had expected from him. But it didn't come. It couldn't. Samuel swallowed the lump in his throat. his eyes darting toward the horizon, where the last streaks of sunset were fading into darkness. The past was creeping up on him again, like it always did. A man taught to give, not receive. He had spent his whole life believing one thing. A man's worth was in what he gave, not what he took. And now his sons were trying to give him something too big. Too much. Samuel had given them a home, a family, a future, and he had done it without expecting anything in return. But this was a house. Not just a gesture, not just a birthday gift or a new set of Sunday clothes. It was permanent. It was too heavy. It was a reminder of what his own father had lost. Samuel had been a boy when he saw his father crumble beneath the weight of losing their family home. He remembered watching his strong, proud father sit at the kitchen table, a single eviction notice in his hands, shoulders slumped in defeat. That house had been everything to his father. And when it was gone, so was the man Samuel had known. He had watched his father shrink into himself, a shadow of the man who once laughed on the porch, whittling wood and humming gospel hymns in the evening light. And now, standing on this porch with his sons, he felt that same fear curling around his ribs. That same weight of history pressing down on him. What if he took their gift and lost it? What if this house broke him the way his father had been broken? The silence that spoke louder than words. Marcus exhaled sharply, breaking the quiet. "We thought you'd be happy, Dad." His voice wasn't angry, but it carried an edge. Behind him, Devin crossed his arms, his frustration barely hidden. Samuel's eyes darted between them, landing briefly on Jamal, Eric, and Andra. They were all waiting for him to say something, to be grateful, to smile, but he couldn't. He ran a hand down his face, rubbing the tension from his temples. "Son," he started, his voice thicker than usual. "I don't know if I can." "You can," Devin cut in. "You just don't want to." His tone was sharper than before, his usual fire now turning to heat. "We planned this for years," Devin continued, stepping forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "We put everything into this. Money, time, sweat. We built this house with our own hands. You hear me? Our hands." Samuel's jaw tightened. It wasn't anger he felt, it was fear. But Devin couldn't see that. He saw rejection. "I didn't ask for this," Samuel said, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. Devin scoffed. "Yeah, we know. You never ask for anything. That's the problem." Marcus held up a hand, stopping Devin before he went any further. Samuel watched as Marcus inhaled slowly, steadying himself the way he always had before making a hard decision. His eldest son was trying to be patient, trying to understand. But Samuel could see the disappointment in his eyes. Marcus' voice was measured when he finally spoke. "You don't have to ask, Dad," he said. "That's not how family works." Eric finally speaks. Eric had been silent through the entire exchange, his gaze unreadable as he leaned against the porch railing. But now, as the tension thickened, he finally spoke. "You think taking this house is a betrayal?" Samuel's chest tightened. He turned his gaze toward his quietest son, the one who always saw what no one else did. Eric's dark eyes locked onto his father's. "You're thinking about Grandpa," Eric said simply, "aren't you?" Jamal and Ander looked at each other, realization dawning. Samuel felt exposed. Like Eric had read his heart and laid it out for the others to see. "Eric," Marcus warned softly. But Eric didn't stop. "You think that if you accept this house, it means—" He hesitated, searching for the words. "That you're taking something your father never got to have. That it's not fair." Samuel's stomach twisted. A lump formed in his throat. Because that was exactly it. Exactly the thing he hadn't been able to say out loud. Eric had found the truth buried in his silence. For years, Samuel had carried the weight of his father's loss. And now, standing here with his sons, he didn't know how to let it go. Marcus' last attempt. The night had grown colder. The wind carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and pine, the sounds of the countryside wrapping around them like a blanket. Marcus exhaled again, slower this time, and took a step closer to his father. His voice was quieter now, almost gentle. "Dad." Samuel met his gaze. "This isn't about what Grandpa lost," Marcus said. "It's about what you've built." Samuel blinked. Marcus kept going. "You think we're giving you a house because you don't have one. But we're not." He shook his head. "We're giving you this house because you deserve it. Because for our whole lives, you have given us a home. And now it's time for you to have yours." Samuel's chest ached. His hands trembled. Marcus' voice dropped lower. "And you know what Grandpa would have wanted." Samuel stayed silent. Marcus placed a firm hand on his father's shoulder. "He would have wanted you to have this, Dad." Samuel's throat closed. His hands tightened into fists at his sides. Because now he didn't know if he had the strength to refuse. The house that waits. A long silence stretched between them before Samuel finally exhaled, long and slow. His heart thundered in his chest as he turned his gaze to the gravel driveway. He knew where they wanted to take him. He knew what waited for him down that road. The house. His house. A home his sons had built for him. But was he ready? Could he walk onto that porch without feeling his father's shadow following behind? Could he enter that house without feeling like he was stepping into someone else's dream? Samuel wasn't sure, but his sons were waiting, and the past would not let him go. The house that waited. The night was still heavy with the tension that had settled over the Hayes family. A gift had been given, one so profound, so permanent, but it hung in the air like an unanswered question. Pastor Samuel Hayes stood at the edge of his porch, his sons behind him, waiting for his next move. Beyond the trees, beyond the winding dirt road that led away from his small home, another house stood waiting. His house. The house they had built for him. And yet, his feet remained rooted to the old wooden planks of the porch. He couldn't move forward. He couldn't leave this place, the place where he had raised his boys, where he had spent his years giving and never receiving. Marcus, standing closest, watched him carefully. "Dad." His voice was quiet, careful, as if speaking too loudly would break something fragile between them. "Come with us." Samuel exhaled slowly, his breath shaky. It should have been an easy answer, but the truth was, he was terrified. Not of the house itself, but of what it meant. Because accepting it meant letting go. Letting go of the past. Letting go of the guilt. Letting go of the belief that he was supposed to give and never take. How did a man unlearn a lifetime of sacrifice? The drive to the unknown. Samuel didn't realize he had agreed until he found himself in Marcus' car, the quiet rumble of the engine filling the space between them. The ride was long and silent. Devin and Jamal followed in another vehicle, while Eric and Andrew trailed behind. Samuel watched the trees blur past the window, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Marcus didn't push him to talk. He just drove. Each turn of the road took Samuel further from the life he had built, the life he had controlled, and toward something new. The thought unnerved him. It had been decades since he had last felt this kind of uncertainty. Not since the day he had taken in 5 orphan boys, boys who had walked into his life with baggage too heavy for their small shoulders. Back then, he had taken a leap of faith. He had trusted. Now, they were asking him to do the same. But why was it so hard? The house on the hill. The car slowed as they turned onto a new road, a road Samuel had never driven before. His stomach tightened. The gravel crunched beneath the tires, and then he saw it. His breath caught. The house stood at the top of a small hill, its white siding gleaming under the moonlight. The wraparound porch stretched wide, just like his childhood home. The green shutters, the red tin roof, the exact porch swing he remembered. It was perfect. So perfect it felt like a dream. Samuel's fingers trembled as he reached for the door handle. But he didn't open it. Not yet. Marcus parked the car, turning off the engine, and silence filled the air. No one spoke. Samuel just stared. His throat tightened, his chest aching in a way he didn't fully understand. His son stood beside him now, watching him carefully. Waiting. Andrew was the first to speak. "Dad," he said softly, almost hesitantly, "it's really yours." The word struck something deep within Samuel, something he wasn't ready for. His fingers curled into his palms. He stepped forward, just once, then stopped. Devin watched him closely, his frustration from earlier softened now. "You don't have to say anything," Devin said, his voice quieter than usual. "Just look." Samuel forced his legs to move, climbing the porch steps one at a time. The wood felt solid beneath his feet. Real. He placed his hand on the railing, his thumb tracing the grain of the wood, the same pattern his father used to carve. His eyes burned. His heart pounded. This was more than a house. It was a resurrection, a piece of his childhood, his history, rebuilt by his son's hands. They had done this. For him. He turned slightly, his voice rough when he finally spoke. "You boys really did this." Marcus nodded. "Every detail, Dad." Samuel exhaled sharply. It was too much. The walls of his past were breaking down, and he didn't know how to stop it. So instead of stepping inside, he turned away. A father's breaking point. The porch fell into absolute silence. The moment should have been perfect, but Samuel was walking away, turning his back on their gift. Marcus' face hardened. Devin's expression twisted with disbelief. "Seriously," Devin's voice rose, barely contained. "You're really gonna walk away from this?" Samuel's hands shook. I can't, son." Devin's frustration exploded. "Why?" "Because Grandpa lost his house. Because you think accepting this is some kind of betrayal." Marcus flinched at the words. Eric and Jamal looked away, their silence deafening. Samuel turned, his voice shaking. "You don't understand, Devin." Devin stepped closer. "No, you don't understand." His voice cracked now, his heart laid bare. "You spent your whole life giving, Dad. And we took it. We took everything you gave us. And you never asked for anything back." Samuel's chest felt tight. Devin's next words nearly shattered him. "But did you ever think," Devin whispered, "that maybe we needed to give something back?" The words knocked the breath from his lungs. Samuel closed his eyes, his fingers gripping the porch railing so tight his knuckles turned white. Devin's voice softened, raw and real. "You taught us how to love, Dad. Let us love you back." Samuel's throat closed, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to say. The weight of love. The porch was silent again. But this time, it wasn't a silence of anger. It was understanding. Samuel opened his eyes, his vision blurred with unshed tears. His fingers relaxed on the railing. The past still clung to him, but his sons were here. They weren't asking him to forget his father. They weren't asking him to erase his past. They were asking him to trust them, to let himself be loved. Samuel inhaled deeply, and for the first time, he turned toward the house, instead of away from it. The weight of love. Samuel stood frozen on the porch, his body caught between two choices, to step forward into the house his sons had built for him, or to turn away, back into the safety of what he had always known. He could feel the expectation in the air, the way his sons were watching him, waiting. Their hope was palpable, stretching between them like an unspoken prayer. Marcus took a slow step forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Dad, just come inside. That's all we're asking. Just walk through the door." Samuel's fingers twitched at his sides. It seemed like such a simple request. Just walk inside. But it wasn't simple for him. Because if he stepped into that house, it would mean accepting it. It would mean accepting that he was worthy of something so permanent, so grand, so undeserved. And he had spent his whole life believing that he was meant to give, not take. The first step. Samuel exhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling with the weight of it all. He could feel his son's eyes on him, waiting, hoping, believing. His heart pounded against his ribs as he finally lifted his foot and placed it on the threshold. The simple movement felt monumental, like stepping across a divide that had separated him from his sons for too long. His breath shook as he stepped inside. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, he felt everything hit him at once. The warmth of the wood beneath his feet, the scent of fresh paint mixed with something older, something familiar, like memories wrapped in new beginnings. His gaze swept the room, and his knees nearly buckled. A house of memories. The living room wasn't just a house. It was a reflection of his past. It was his childhood home, rebuilt. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes moved across the space. The same fireplace his mother used to warm the house on cold nights. The same wooden beams his father had carved with his own hands. The same colors on the walls, painted exactly as he remembered. His eyes landed on the bookshelf. His father's old Bible sat there, resting against a row of carefully selected books, ones that had filled Samuel's life as both a father and a preacher. His breath grew shallow. They had thought of everything. How? His voice cracked, and he cleared his throat, his hands trembling. How did you boys do all this? Jamal was the one to answer, his voice calm, steady. We found old pictures, he said. We remembered the stories you told us growing up. We made sure every detail was right. Eric's voice came next, soft but filled with conviction. We built it so you wouldn't just have a house, Dad. We built it so you'd have home. Samuel's vision blurred with unshed tears. The dining table that held a lifetime. His feet moved on their own, drawn toward the dining table in the center of the room. The wood was smooth, polished, yet carried a familiar, worn feel, like it had already lived a lifetime of memories. Samuel ran his fingers across it, a lump forming in his throat. He knew this table. It was the same design as the one his family had owned when he was a child. The one where his father used to sit at the head of the table, saying grace with a voice filled with unwavering faith. The one where Samuel had once sat as a boy, swinging his legs beneath the wooden bench, listening to his mother hum hymns while she served cornbread. The same table where his father had sat one last time before the bank took everything from them. Samuel's hands tightened against the wood, his chest aching with the weight of grief and love. Marcus watched him carefully. You remember it, don't you? Samuel nodded, unable to speak. His throat was too tight, his heart too full. Andrea, the youngest, stepped closer. His voice was softer than usual, hesitant but filled with emotion. We wanted you to have it again, Dad, he whispered, so you'd never feel like you lost it. A father's breaking point. Samuel closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. He wasn't sure what broke him first. Was it the bookshelf with his father's Bible? Was it the dining table, crafted to match the one he had lost as a child? Or was it simply the love in the room, the overwhelming realization that his sons had done all of this for him, not out of obligation, but out of pure, unwavering love? Whatever it was, the dam finally broke. A shuddering breath escaped him. His legs wobbled, and before he could stop himself, he sank into a chair, his hands covering his face. His shoulders shook. His sons froze. Samuel Hayes, the man who had always stood strong, the man who had sacrificed everything for them, was crying. The moment that changed everything. Andrew moved first. Before any of the others could react, he crossed the room in 2 quick strides and dropped to his knees in front of his father. His voice was gentle, desperate. Dad, it's okay, he whispered. You don't have to carry it anymore. Samuel's hands fell from his face, revealing red-rimmed eyes, his breath ragged. He looked at each of his sons, one by one, as if trying to comprehend the enormity of what they had done. They weren't just his boys anymore. They were men. Men who had given him something he had never dared to ask for. Devon, the one who had been the most frustrated before, now looked at his father with nothing but love. "We wanted you to have this, Dad," he said, his voice steady. "Not because we thought you needed a house, but because we wanted you to have something permanent, something that proves you deserve it." Samuel's breath hitched. The weight of his son's love settled into his bones, too heavy to fight. And so, for the first time in his life, he let himself receive. With one last shaky exhale, Samuel nodded and whispered the words his sons had been waiting to hear. "This is home. A new beginning, an old ghost." The morning sun painted the world in soft gold, its rays streaming through the windows of Samuel's new home. For the first time in decades, he woke up in a house that wasn't just a shelter, it was his. The air smelled of fresh-cut wood and warm earth, the lingering scent of fresh paint still woven into the space. The house felt alive, filled with a presence that wasn't just his own, but his son's love, their sweat, their sacrifices. But even as the warmth of morning settled into the house, Samuel felt a ghost sitting at the edge of his bed, a ghost he had carried for years. His father. For a moment, Samuel could almost see him, sitting in a chair near the window, looking out over the land with that quiet, lost expression he had worn after the bank had taken their house. And for the first time, Samuel wondered, had his father ever forgiven himself? Had he ever let go of the burden of failure that had weighed him down for so long? Could Samuel? He exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. This was his now. It was time to stop looking at the past like it was a chain wrapped around his throat. Slowly, he got up. He had a house to live in, and he was done letting ghosts take up space in a home built for the living. Morning in a home, that was his. The old wooden floorboards creaked slightly as Samuel made his way into the kitchen. He didn't know why he expected the house to feel foreign, like stepping into someone else's life. Instead, it felt natural, like it had always been here, waiting for him to catch up. The cabinets were stocked, the refrigerator filled with everything he needed. His sons had seen to that. A note was taped to the counter, Marcus' neat handwriting standing out against the white paper. "Dad, everything's set up for you. Let us know if you need anything. We'll be back soon. This is home now. Marcus." Samuel ran his fingers over the note, his chest tight. They weren't letting him go back to the way things were. He wasn't going to be alone again. A warm chuckle escaped him as he shook his head. Stubborn boys. But the truth was, he had raised them that way, and he had never been prouder. A walk through memories. With his coffee in hand, Samuel made his way through the house at a slow, deliberate pace. Every room held something familiar. A memory, a small piece of his past woven into the present. In the living room, his father's old Bible sat on a wooden stand. The leather was worn and cracked, the edges frayed from years of handling. His fingers brushed over the cover, remembering the nights his father had read from it, his deep voice filling the house with words of faith, even when hope seemed lost. Samuel swallowed hard. It was still here. His father's memory. But instead of feeling like a weight, it felt like a blessing. He moved on. In the hallway, framed photographs lined the walls. Not just of his sons, but of him with them. His first Christmas with the boys. Jamal's graduation. Devon's first football championship. Marcus, Eric, and Anders standing by his side at church, each wearing their Sunday best. Samuel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They had built more than a house. They had built a place where his life was honored, where every sacrifice he had made was remembered and valued. It wasn't just a home. It was a tribute. And he finally understood. They weren't trying to erase the past. They were showing him that his past had mattered, that it had been worth something. His throat tightened. He reached out and adjusted a slightly tilted frame. "Perfect," he murmured, stepping back. Then he turned toward the room that had been waiting for him the most. The study, the letter that changed everything. Samuel hesitated at the door. Something about this room. It felt like a place where the past had settled itself, waiting to be acknowledged. He stepped inside. The desk was sturdy, well-crafted. The bookshelves held his entire life's work, sermons, old journals, even letters from congregation members over the years. But something else was waiting for him. Something he hadn't seen in decades. An envelope, yellowed with time. A name scrawled across it in old, familiar handwriting. James Hayes, Samuel's father. His hand shook as he reached for it, his breath hitching in his throat. His father's letter, the one he had written to the bank, begging them to let him keep their home. Marcus must have found it. Must have put it here for Samuel to face, to deal with. His fingers traced the fragile paper. The ink faded but still legible. His father's words were desperate, pleading, filled with the quiet shame of a man who had done everything he could and still failed. Samuel closed his eyes, his jaw tightening. All these years, he had carried the same guilt. The same belief that accepting something he hadn't built with his own hands meant he was failing as a man. But that wasn't true. His father hadn't failed. And neither had he. His sons hadn't built this house to make him feel weak. They had built it because they loved him. Because they wanted him to stop carrying burdens that were never his to hold in the first place. His hands gripped the letter. Then, slowly, he folded it and placed it back in the drawer, letting it rest, letting himself rest, letting go. Samuel stepped outside onto the porch, the morning air crisp against his skin. His rocking chair waited for him, the wood cool beneath his fingers as he lowered himself into it. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about what had been lost. He wasn't thinking about what could have been. He was here. He was home. A single tear slipped down his weathered cheek. But this time, it wasn't a tear of grief. It was peace. And in the quiet morning air, as the sun warmed his skin, Samuel whispered the words that had taken him a lifetime to say. I deserve this. And deep in his soul, he finally believed it. The circle comes full. 2 weeks later, the house stood still in the soft evening light, a symbol of new beginnings. The rooms that had once echoed with uncertainty were now filled with life, laughter, and the quiet presence of a family restored. Samuel sat on the front porch, his legs stretched out and crossed at the ankles. The rocking chair moved slowly beneath him, its rhythmic motion a soothing beat in the cool southern night air. He'd spent the last 2 weeks finding his place in the home his sons had given him. At first, it had felt too big, too unfamiliar. But now, it felt like a part of him, like the warmth of sunlight filtering through the trees, or the sound of crickets in the distance. It wasn't perfect, no house ever would be, but it was his. His gaze drifted over the freshly mown lawn, the swing on the porch swaying gently, and his thoughts began to settle into a familiar routine. Waking up, walking through the rooms, drinking coffee at the kitchen table, and letting the quiet seep into his bones. But just as he felt himself fully relaxing into the comfort of it, the sound of tires on gravel broke through his thoughts. The car doors slammed, followed by the unmistakable voices of his sons. The boys are back. The front door opened, and Samuel stood slowly, his bones creaking as he made his way to greet them. Marcus, the eldest, was the first to step out of the car. His professional demeanor was softened, his smile wider than usual as he looked toward his father. Behind him, Devin bounced out, grinning like a boy on Christmas morning, Andrew close behind, already halfway up the steps, his energy filling the air like an electric current. Jamal and Eric walked in tandem, their usual silence no longer heavy, but more like a comfortable understanding between them. Samuel stepped onto the porch, waiting. He didn't know why the sight of them together, all 5 of them, filled him with such a profound mix of emotions. Perhaps it was because he had watched them grow from scared boys to strong men. Perhaps it was because he had seen their hearts and souls in their work, the work they had put into this house, into him. "Hey, Pop," Devin called, his voice louder than it needed to be. But that was just Devin. always wanting to fill the silence with sound. Samuel's lips curved into a smile. "You boys trying to make me deaf." Laughter rang out, familiar and warm, as they surrounded him. Jamal's hand slapped his father's back in that way that showed respect, but also affection. "How are you, Dad? You good?" Samuel chuckled, feeling the weight of his years lift, replaced with the easy companionship of family. "I'm good," he said, his voice deep and steady. "Just getting used to the quiet." Andrew flopped down on the porch swing, his usual restless energy not dissipating even in adulthood. "You're not used to this quiet, are you, Pop? You used to the noise we used to make." The others chuckled, and Samuel's eyes twinkled. He nodded. "I've missed it more than I thought I would. You boys do know how to fill a house." Marcus nodded, stepping forward. "We'll keep it filled, Dad." And for the first time in weeks, Samuel felt truly at peace. There would be more visits, more laughter, and most importantly, there would be no more empty rooms. Not in this house. Not in his life. A quiet conversation, long overdue. They sat together on the porch as the evening darkened into night, and the stars began to sprinkle the sky. The glow of the porch light cast a soft halo over the family, each of them seated in a comfortable circle. For the first time in a long time, Samuel felt no weight on his shoulders. The house was his, yes, but the people around him were what truly made it a home. Devin, as always, was the first to break the comfortable silence. "Dad, can I ask you something?" He was fiddling with the edge of his shirt, nervous, a rare sight for him. "Of course, son." Samuel's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. He knew his son had something weighing on him. Devin's voice dropped lower. "About that house we built for you." "Devin," Marcus interrupted, looking at his younger brother with a soft warning. But Devin didn't seem to notice. "No," Devin said, his voice a little firmer. His eyes locked on their father. "I need to ask this." Samuel sat forward, instinctively sensing the shift. "What's on your mind, son? You really didn't want to take it, did you?" Devin asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I could see it in your eyes. When we gave it to you, when we showed it to you, you were holding back. Why? Why did it take so long for you to accept it?" The words hit Samuel hard. The question that had been lingering inside him for so long, the question he had never dared to ask aloud, was now being spoken. For a moment, Samuel didn't speak. His heart thudded in his chest, and his thoughts flashed back to the night they had all been standing together, the porch light casting shadows across his sons' faces. They had given him a gift that had carried the weight of years, and he had rejected it. The fear had held him back, the fear that accepting their gift meant he was not their father anymore, but someone who needed saving. The silence between father and son stretched before Samuel finally spoke, his voice deep and raw. "I didn't think I deserved it," he said simply, his voice breaking on the words. "I spent my whole life teaching you boys how to give, how to sacrifice, how to be there for others. But when it came time for me to receive something, it felt like I was betraying my father, like I was doing something I wasn't supposed to do." His words hung heavy in the air as his sons absorbed them. The familiar sound of the crickets chirping in the distance seemed to echo the silence. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice calm and steady. "Dad, you taught us how to give, but you also taught us how to love. And love isn't about giving until it hurts or sacrificing without receiving. Love is about trust, about accepting the love we have for you, just like we've always seen you do for us." The first family dinner in the new home. The evening progressed, and soon they moved inside to the dining table, where the familiar smell of food filled the air. The table, now fully set, was a symbol of the new life they had created together, a blend of old memories and new beginnings. The laughter flowed easily as they ate, the tension from earlier finally melting into comfortable conversation. Samuel watched his sons, each with their own journey, their own struggles, but each of them had found their way back to him. "Remember when you boys used to sneak your peas under your plates?" Samuel asked, his voice full of fondness. "Thought I wouldn't catch you." Devin rolled his eyes, laughing. "You always caught us, Pop. Always." "I had to," Samuel teased. "You were my boys. Had to make sure you were eating right." Eric, who had been quieter than the others, finally spoke. "Dad, we're all grown now. You don't have to watch us so closely anymore." Samuel smiled. "But I always will, Eric, always." It was a moment of unity, of peace, and of acceptance, not just of the house, but of each other. They had finally all come full circle. The house wasn't just wood and nails. It was built with love, sacrifice, and the quiet promise that, no matter where life took them, they would always have each other. For the first time, Samuel looked around the table at his sons, no longer boys, but men, and saw not just their faces but the legacy he had left them. A legacy of love, of giving, of receiving. As the evening wore on, Samuel leaned back in his chair, his heart full. And for the first time in years, he felt whole. Full circle. As the last dish was cleared away, and the evening came to a close, the house settled into a peaceful stillness. The sound of laughter still echoed faintly in the corners, but now the walls held a more serene energy, one that had been absent for too long. Samuel remained at the table, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. The scent of the meal lingered in the air, a reminder of the family gathering they had just shared. Outside, the night sky was heavy with stars, their light soft and distant, just like the hopes and dreams Samuel had for his sons. He had lived his life giving, always the one to offer guidance, wisdom, and support. But tonight, for the first time, he felt the love returned in a way he hadn't even known he needed. His heart was full, not just because of the house, but because of the moment they had shared together as a family, one that had transcended the walls of any building. As he sat in the quiet, the sounds of his sons retreating to their rooms filled the house. He had told them they could stay as long as they wanted, and they had promised to come back more often. The promise of more visits, more moments like this, was something Samuel had longed for. For years, the silence of this house had felt like an empty echo. But now, the stillness was full of hope, full of memories, and full of the promise of a future that included all of them, together, in ways they hadn't experienced in far too long. The final lesson. Samuel's eyes wandered to the old family Bible sitting on the mantel. The pages were worn from decades of use, the leather cracked and faded, yet it was still here, just like his father's memory. He hadn't expected to find peace in his father's absence, but now he understood something he hadn't before. The loss wasn't permanent. The love they had shared, the sacrifices, the struggles, wasn't erased. It was transformed. His father's legacy wasn't just in the house that was lost, but in the family they had created, the lessons passed down, the love that had survived. Samuel slowly stood, his knees creaking with the familiar protest of age. He walked over to the Bible, picking it up carefully. As he opened it to the well-worn pages, he ran his fingers over the verses his father had read to him, the words that had carried him through his own struggles. And as he did, a realization settled within him. He had spent his life trying to fill the empty spaces with actions, but now he knew the truth. The empty spaces weren't for him to fill. They had already been filled by the people who loved him, by the home he had built in their hearts. The house was just a symbol, a place where love could settle, where memories could be made. He closed the Bible gently and placed it back on the mantel. It was time to stop living in the past and to embrace what was before him. A new chapter begins. The next morning, Samuel woke up earlier than usual. The sun was just beginning to filter through the windows, casting long, soft shadows on the floor. He stretched and sighed, the comfort of his bed filling him with a sense of peace that had been absent for so many years. As he stood and moved to the kitchen, he found the house already stirring. Divin was in the kitchen, frying bacon and eggs. Jamal was at the table, already reading through some papers. Eric was sitting at the counter, his coffee mug in hand, his usual quiet demeanor still present, but now in sync with the energy of the home. And there, sitting by the window, was Andrew, his usual mischievous smile now calm and content as he gazed out at the peaceful morning light. Samuel paused for a moment, watching them. For years, he had thought that the home was the walls and the roof, the furniture and the photographs. But now, as he stood there, he knew it was more than that. Home was in the people. It was in the love they had for one another, in the memories they would create, and in the joy they shared. His sons had built him a house, yes, but they had also built him a family that wasn't defined by the past, but by the present and the future, a family that wasn't bound by loss, but by the strength they had found together. "Good morning, Dad," Devon called out, grinning from the stove. "Coffee's on." Samuel smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. "It's good to have you all home." And for the first time in his life, he truly felt like he had everything he needed. The house wasn't just a place to live. It was a home. Epilogue. Love's legacy. The years would pass, as they always did. The house would weather storms and endure the quiet moments, the bustling days, and the sound of life flowing through it. The walls would see more laughter, more memories, and more love than Samuel had ever imagined possible. His sons would come and go, each carving their own path in the world. But they would always return to this place, to this home, built with sweat, sacrifice, and love. And in the quiet, on evenings just like this one, Samuel would find himself sitting in the rocking chair, his hands resting lightly on the armrests, watching the sunset over the land his father had once fought to keep. But now he wasn't just looking at the land. He was looking at the family he had raised, the home he had built, and the legacy he had passed on. The legacy of love. A legacy that would never fade.